Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah, your safety trainer, here with today's lesson on bullying in the workplace. Remember to sign off on your mobile device or online to receive credit for this training. If you need to pause this video at any time to have a discussion, please feel free to do so. Bullying in the workplace is an issue that is not always addressed directly. There can be many reasons for this, but some may include victims switching departments, leaving the company, or keeping quiet about the harassment. Employees should be free from harassment of any kind while at work, and bullying will not be tolerated. The following information is to be used as a guide to educate employees on how to respond to workplace bullies. Because bullying can be a sensitive subject, think of what you can do to be a positive influence in your work environment. This lesson will cover how you can recognize the signs of bullying, what is not included in the definition of bullying, and how to respond appropriately to a bully in the workplace. Sometimes bullying or psychological harassment is subtle and difficult to distinguish whether it was intentional or simply a personality clash. Before you jump to a conclusion one way or another, here are some signs to look for if you suspect bullying in the workplace. You get extremely anxious on Sunday night before your work week. You may even throw up. You seem to be constantly criticized despite putting forth your best efforts. You have been insulted, yelled at, or humiliated at work, in front of others or alone. A coworker seems to keep a mental record of your previous mistakes and often refers to them. There have been rumors spread around the workplace about you. You feel that you have been isolated or are often not invited to group lunches or meetings. You feel drained or lifeless on your days off, or you frequently take mental health days. A coworker has done something that has directly affected your progress, for example, sabotage. There have been frequent last-minute changes to your schedule or duties for no reason. A coworker seems eager to take the credit for work you have done. There can be many things that create the previous scenarios, but we want to be very clear on this. Bullying does not include the following: a difference of opinion, constructive feedback or work-related advice, or a supervisor or employer assessing your work performance.
Hey everyone, if you just watched this video and are thinking, how do I get more of these videos? Click on this link or go to gotsafety.com and we'll show you how you can digitally sign and record employee training records, build custom forms, or even access your OSHA documentation. Go to gotsafety.com right now or call 1-800-734-3574 for more information.